Back, the chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Alaska, Ms. Peltola, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. I represent Alaska, and Alaska really depends on oil and gas development. So much of our state's economy, households, about a third of our households are part of that sector, and it pays household bills. But at the statewide level, it is the vast majority of our revenues that make sure that the state is doing its constitutionally required obligations of schools, public safety, public transportation. And so we're very serious and earnest and absolute about our need for responsible development. And at the same time, I think to a person in Alaska, they could give you about 50 examples of climate change. We had 5 snowless winters. It's impacted almost all of our species. We have a lot of species in crisis. So we, as Alaskans, we really are balancing these two things. But to my great surprise, not everybody knows about NEPA. When I came here, I was shocked to find out that people on the East Coast don't know the acronyms that are just part of our vernacular in Alaska, a FEIS and a ROD and all of those things. But one of the things I'm very concerned about is public input, because that is integral to the NEPA process, is that iterative process of preferred alternatives and getting to the perfect compromise. And I just wondered, Mr. Sandberg, this question is for you. How can Congress help support the efforts of companies you represent while ensuring local community input? And is the EIS process for development projects sufficient for local input?
So we appreciate the question. I think from the very beginning, in the earliest stages of clean energy development, our developers are engaging with communities. They have to, in an open and transparent way. And I think that as we do that, we find that oftentimes project opposition comes from many forms, but also oftentimes is full of misinformation. So as we engage early in that process, both disadvantaged communities, local communities, as we seek permits from state, local, and federal agencies, we find that early, frequent, sustained engagement helps us find a more smooth process. Do I think that there can be reforms to the NEPA process? Absolutely. Right? I think that there are some common sense things that we can do together that, and many of those we've detailed in written testimony and we're happy to engage on, but I do think there are some process improvements that can be made on NEPA.
And then I have a question for you, Ms. Johnson. And as I mentioned, I want to ensure local communities have a clear seat at the table. And I firmly believe that residents know best, and they know better than anyone how to protect their environment. And do you think that industry is doing enough in that regard?
Thank you for the question. I think that it is important for industry to look holistically at the impact of a project. And so taking the time to hear from people who have a real lived experience is critical. I think taking the time to do an environmental assessment so that we are considering the cumulative impact and exposure that people might have to a particular project is important and necessary. I think it's a false narrative to suggest that to do those things is too detailed and it's too costly. We, as I stated earlier, incur cost when we go around community, when we don't consider them. We incur cost because we did not appropriately plan or budget for a project. And so I think that to reference, a comment earlier about, hypothetical studies, being unnecessary. We don't think that they're hypothetical. We think that they're important. They consider the economic, the environmental, the public health impacts, and what that might cost us. And it's important for us to do it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my time.